Open the door, now. Officer Frank Holloway's fist slammed against the weathered front door again, harder this time. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street like a gunshot. No answer. From inside the house, a child cried. Not loud, not screaming, just a thin, exhausted sound, the kind that comes from a throat too dry to wail anymore. Frank's jaw tightened. "Sir?" the younger officer behind him whispered, shifting uneasily. "Dispatch says the house is empty. No utilities, no registered occupants. It's been flagged vacant for over 6 years." Frank didn't turn around. "Then explain the crying," he snapped. The wind rustled through dead leaves along the curb. The house sat slumped between two well-kept homes, its paint peeling, windows clouded with grime. The porch light was broken. The mailbox overflowed with old flyers and yellowed envelopes. Everything about the place said abandoned, everything except the sound coming from behind the locked door. Another cry slipped through the cracks, weaker this time. Frank stepped back and kicked the door. "Police! Open up! We can hear the child!" Silence. Then something worse. A thud, like a small body hitting the floor. The younger officer, Jamie Ruiz, went pale. "Jesus, Frank." Frank pressed his radio. "Dispatch, we have confirmed distress sounds from inside, requesting permission for forced entry." The response crackled back, sharp and dismissive. "Negative, Holloway. Records show no residents. Property is condemned. Could be a prank or an animal." Frank felt heat rise in his chest. "An animal doesn't say please," he growled. "That was a child." A pause. Then the voice returned, colder. "Stand down, officer. Without visual confirmation or registered occupants, you do not have authorization to breach. Wait for animal control." Frank turned slowly, eyes blazing. "Animal control?" he repeated. "There's a kid in there." "Protocol is protocol," Dispatch replied. "You force that door and you'll answer for it." The line went dead. Jamie swallowed. "Frank, you know they'll hang you out to dry if you break it down without clearance." Frank stared at the door. The crying started again. Softer now. Broken. "Protocol didn't hold my daughter when she was dying in the ICU. People did." He stepped back, squared his shoulders, and kicked again. The door didn't budge. Jamie hesitated, then moved beside him. "I'm with you. If this is wrong, we'll be wrong together." They kicked in unison. The door cracked. Inside, the air smelled stale, mold, dust, and something else, something sour. Frank shoved the door open. The house was dark. No furniture, no lights, no signs of life. Except, there, Jamie pointed. In the hallway, a small shape moved. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, sat curled against the wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her hair was matted, her clothes hung loose, filthy. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes lifted slowly. And when she saw the uniforms, she flinched. Please don't tell him I made noise." Frank's heart dropped into his boots. "Tell who, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling slowly so he wouldn't scare her. She shook her head, trembling. "I was quiet. I promise, I was quiet." Jamie scanned the house, hand on his weapon. "Frank, this place is empty." The girl's stomach growled, loud enough to echo. Frank took off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You did good," he said gently. "You did real good." Her eyes filled with tears. "He said no one would hear me. He said nobody comes here anymore." Frank looked down the dark hallway. Every instinct in his body screamed the same thing. Someone had put her here. Someone who knew exactly which house records said didn't exist. Sirens wailed in the distance as backup finally arrived, lights painting the broken windows red and blue. Frank lifted the girl carefully into his arms. "You're safe now," he said, even though he wasn't sure yet if it was true. Because as he carried her outside, he noticed something carved on the inside of the front door. 4 words, deep, deliberate. "No one lives here." And Frank knew, with chilling certainty, this was only the beginning. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a hollow thud, sealing the little girl inside with paramedics who moved fast but gently. Frank stood on the curb, arms crossed tight against his chest, watching the red lights pulse against the cracked siding of the abandoned house. Jamie exhaled shakily beside him. "She's alive," he said, like he needed to say it out loud to believe it. "She's actually alive." Frank nodded, but his eyes never left the house. Something about it felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, like the place was holding its breath. Behind them, a black and white pulled up hard. Lieutenant Harris stepped out, gray hair sharp under his cap, irritation written all over his face. "Holloway," Harris snapped, "what the hell were you thinking?" Frank turned slowly. "I was thinking there was a child crying in a locked house." "You violated protocol," Harris barked. "Dispatch ordered you to stand down." "And I ordered myself not to leave a kid to die," Frank shot back. Harris looked past him toward the ambulance. His jaw clenched when he saw the small form through the rear window. "Who is she?" Harris asked, voice lowering despite himself. "We don't know yet. No ID. No missing persons alert matching her description." Harris rubbed his temples. "You understand the position you've put us in, Frank." Frank stepped closer, dropping his voice. "You understand the position she was in?" Silence hung between them, thick and uncomfortable. From the ambulance, a paramedic leaned out. "Lieutenant, we need to transport now. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished. If she hadn't been found today—" He didn't finish the sentence. Harris nodded stiffly. "Go." As the ambulance pulled away, Frank finally allowed himself to breathe, just a little. But relief didn't last, because now the questions were starting. Inside the house, crime scene tape fluttered weakly in the breeze. Forensics moved through the space with gloves and flashlights, documenting every inch. And what they found made no sense. There was no food, no running water, no electricity. No bedding, except for a thin blanket on the hallway floor where the girl had been curled up. No toys, no clothes, just one plastic bottle with a few drops of cloudy water left inside. And carved into the door, "No one lives here." Officer Ruiz stood staring at it, arms wrapped around himself. "Who does that?" he muttered. "Who writes that?" Frank didn't answer, because he was too busy staring at the scratch marks on the inside of the doorframe, small, uneven, like fingernails. At the hospital, nurses rushed the girl into a private room. Doctors spoke in hushed tones, their faces grave. Frank stood in the hallway, hands shoved deep into his pockets, feeling useless. A nurse stepped out a few minutes later. "She's stable for now," she said, "but she's terrified, won't speak much, keeps asking if she's in trouble." Frank swallowed. "Can I see her?" The nurse studied his face, then nodded, briefly. Inside the room, the girl lay under crisp white sheets that swallowed her small body. Her eyes followed Frank warily as he stepped closer. "It's me," he said softly. "You remember?" She barely nodded. "You're not in trouble," he said. "No one's mad at you. You did the right thing." Her lower lip trembled. "He said police don't help," she whispered. "He said they don't listen to kids." Frank felt something crack inside his chest. "Who said that?" he asked gently. She hesitated, eyes darting to the door. "Did someone put you in that house?" he pressed. She nodded again, slower this time. "What's his name?" Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "I'm not supposed to say." Frank leaned back, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe here. He can't hear you now." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face like she was deciding if he was real.
Then she whispered, "He said the house was perfect. He said no one would ever look there." Frank closed his eyes, because whoever he was didn't just abandon a child, he planned it. Across town, city records were already being pulled, property files, utility logs, ownership history. The house had been seized years ago after the previous owner died with no next of kin. It had bounced between city departments, forgotten in paperwork limbo. The perfect place to disappear something, or someone. Jamie leaned over Frank's shoulder, staring at the file. There's no record of anyone accessing that property in years. Frank tapped the screen. Then someone knew the system well enough to exploit it. Like a city employee? Jamie asked quietly. Frank didn't respond. Later that night, Child Protective Services arrived. The social worker, a tired woman named Denise, sat with Frank in the waiting room. "She doesn't have a name in any database," Denise said. "No school records, no medical history. It's like she never was born." Frank clenched his jaw. "That's impossible." Denise shrugged helplessly. "You'd be surprised. She keeps asking for someone named Mama Joe, but she won't explain who that is." Frank's ears perked up. "She said Mama?" "Yes, but not like a parent, more like a rule, a voice." Frank stood. "I need to talk to her again." Inside the room, the girl watched the ceiling like she expected it to collapse. "Sweetheart," Frank said softly, "who is Mama Joe?" Her eyes flicked to Frank. "She tells us when to be quiet." "Us?" Frank repeated. Her breathing quickened. "How many others are there?" he asked. She pressed her hands over her ears. "I wasn't supposed to tell." Frank felt the weight of it settle deep in his gut. This wasn't one child. This was something bigger, something hidden. And as Frank stepped back into the hallway, Harris was waiting for him, arms crossed, face tight. "You're off the case," the lieutenant said flatly. Frank stared at him. "What?" "Internal Affairs wants a statement. City wants this handled clean. You forced entry against orders." "So you're punishing me," Frank said, rising, "for saving a child?" "I'm protecting the department," Harris snapped. "This is bigger than you." Frank laughed bitterly. "No, it's bigger than you." Harris leaned in. "Drop it, Frank. Let the system work." Frank looked back at the hospital room door, at the small shadow visible through the glass, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he stepped away now, that child, and whoever else was out there, would disappear all over again. And this time, no one would hear them cry.
Frank Holloway sat alone in his car outside the hospital long after his shift officially ended. The engine was off. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. The city hummed faintly around him. Distant sirens, a passing bus, the low murmur of life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the system was already trying to bury it. His phone buzzed, a text from Jamie. "They pulled you off officially. Harris says IA opens tomorrow. You okay?" Frank stared at the screen, then typed back, "Not leaving this, not now." He slid the phone into his pocket and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. 32 years on the force, it taught him one thing above all else. When bureaucracy moves fast, it's usually not to protect the innocent. It's to protect itself. Inside the hospital, the girl, the child with no records, no name, slept fitfully under light sedation. Denise from CPS sat nearby, typing notes into a tablet, though her eyes kept drifting back to the small body in the bed. Frank stood in the doorway quietly. "She talk anymore?" he asked. Denise shook her head. "Just keeps repeating one phrase in her sleep." Frank stepped closer. "What phrase?" Denise hesitated. "Be quiet, or you disappear." Frank's stomach dropped. That wasn't something a child made up. That was something a child was taught. The next morning, Frank wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the case. His badge access had already been flagged, his patrol car reassigned. But he showed up anyway, not in uniform, not officially. just a man who refused to look away. He started where every hidden crime eventually leaks: old paper. City Hall's records department smelled like dust and stale coffee. Frank signed in as a civilian, flashing a tired smile at the clerk who barely looked up. Property seizures, vacant structures, transitional housing. He dug for hours, and then he found it. A sub-file buried beneath zoning corrections. Temporary child placement, emergency overflow, closed. The program had been approved 12 years earlier during a funding crisis, meant to house displaced children temporarily when foster systems overflowed. But it had been paused. Not shut down, paused. Frank printed everything. Names jumped off the page: administrators, social workers, city liaisons. One name repeated more than the others: Josephine Carter. Nickname field: Mama Joe. Frank felt cold spread through his veins. At the hospital later that afternoon, he sat beside the girl again. She was awake now, sipping juice through a straw with trembling hands. "Do you remember me?" he asked gently. She nodded. "You broke the door." "I did," he said softly. "I'm sorry about that." She shook her head quickly. "It was loud, but good loud." Frank smiled faintly. "Can I ask you something?" She looked at Denise, who nodded encouragement. "Mama Joe," Frank said carefully. "Is that Josephine?" The girl froze. Her eyes filled instantly. "She'll hear," she whispered. Frank leaned closer. "Josephine isn't here. You're safe." The girl shook her head harder. "She always hears." Frank swallowed. "How many kids were there?" The girl hesitated, then raised 3 fingers. "3 here?" he asked. She shook her head, then raised both hands, 10 fingers, then pointed down the hall. Frank felt dizzy. "There were more houses." She nodded. "How long were you there?" She looked down. "Since before my birthday." "How old are you now?" She shrugged. 6, I think." Denise covered her mouth. 6 years old. No records, no school, no doctor, just a locked house and silence. Frank stepped into the hallway, his hands shaking. This wasn't neglect. It was systematic disappearance. That evening, Internal Affairs called him in. The room was cold, sterile. 2 investigators sat across the table, files already stacked. "Officer Holloway," one began, "you violated direct orders." "I saved a child." "You compromised a scene." "I entered a locked house where a child was screaming." "You acted emotionally." Frank leaned forward. "If hearing a child cry makes me emotional, then good." They exchanged looks. "This case is being reassigned. You are not to pursue it further." Frank laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You think you can stop me?" The first investigator's voice hardened. "We can end your career." Frank stood. "Then do it, because I'm not ending her." Frank Holloway sat alone in his car outside the hospital long after his shift officially ended. The engine was off. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. The city hummed faintly around him. Distant sirens, a passing bus, the low murmur of life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the system was already trying to bury it. His phone buzzed, a text from Jamie. "They pulled you off officially. Harris says IA opens tomorrow. You okay?" Frank stared at the screen, then typed back, "Not leaving this, not now." He slid the phone into his pocket and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. 32 years on the force had taught him one thing above all else. When bureaucracy moves fast, it's usually not to protect the innocent. It's to protect itself. Inside the hospital, the girl, the child with no records, no name, slept fitfully under light sedation. Denise from CPS sat nearby, typing notes into a tablet, though her eyes kept drifting back to the small body in the bed. Frank stood in the doorway quietly. "She talk anymore?" he asked. Denise shook her head. just keeps repeating one phrase in her sleep. Frank stepped closer. What phrase? Denise hesitated. Be quiet, or you disappear. Frank's stomach dropped. That wasn't something a child made up. That was something a child was taught. The next morning, Frank wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the case. His badge access had already been flagged, his patrol car reassigned. But he showed up anyway. Not in uniform, not officially, just a man who refused to look away. He started where every hidden crime eventually leaks: old paper. City Hall's records department smelled like dust and stale coffee. Frank signed in as a civilian, flashing a tired smile at the clerk who barely looked up. Property seizures, vacant structures, transitional housing. He dug for hours. And then he found it. A sub-file buried beneath zoning corrections. Temporary child placement, emergency overflow, closed. The program had been approved 12 years earlier, during a funding crisis, meant to house displaced children temporarily when foster systems overflowed. But it had been paused, not shut down, paused. Frank printed everything. Names jumped off the page: administrators, social workers, city liaisons. One name repeated more than the others: Josephine Carter. Nickname field: Mama Joe. Frank felt cold spread through his veins. At the hospital later that afternoon, he sat beside the girl again. She was awake now, sipping juice through a straw with trembling hands. Do you remember me? He asked gently. She nodded. You broke the door. I did, he said softly. I'm sorry about that. She shook her head quickly. It was loud, but good loud. Frank smiled faintly. Can I ask you something? She looked at Denise, who nodded encouragement. Josephine, she said carefully, is that Mama Joe? The girl froze. Her eyes filled instantly. She'll hear, she whispered. Frank leaned closer. Josephine isn't here. You're safe. The girl shook her head harder. She always hears. Frank swallowed. How many kids were there? The girl hesitated, then raised 3 fingers. 3 here? He asked. She shook her head, then raised both hands, 10 fingers, then pointed down the hall. Frank felt dizzy. There were more houses? She nodded. How long were you there? She looked down. Since before my birthday. How old are you now? She shrugged. 6, I think. Denise covered her mouth. 6 years old. No records, no school, no doctor, just a locked house and silence. Frank stepped into the hallway, his hand shaking. This wasn't neglect, this was a systematic disappearance. That evening, Internal Affairs called him in. The room was cold, sterile. 2 investigators sat across the table, files already stacked. Officer Holloway, one began, you violated direct orders. I saved a child. You compromised a scene. I entered a locked house where a child was screaming. You acted emotionally. Frank leaned forward. If hearing a child cry makes me emotional, then good. They exchanged looks. This case is being reassigned. You are not to pursue it further. Frank laughed once, sharp and humorless. You think you can stop me? The first investigator's voice hardened. We can end your career. Frank stood. Then do it, 'cause I'm not ending hers. He walked out. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, documents spread out like a map of rot. He circled names, addresses, dates. Josephine Carter, former city contractor, oversaw temporary placements, retired early, no disciplinary actions, too clean. Jamie knocked quietly and let himself in. You're playing with fire, Jamie said, staring at the papers. Fire's already burning, Frank replied. We just pretended it was warmth. Jamie sighed. I pulled something, off the record. Frank looked up. There are 3 other properties like that one. Same zoning loophole, same inactive status. Frank closed his eyes. How many kids? He asked. Jamie swallowed. Unknown. Frank stood. Then we find them. Jamie hesitated. If Harris finds out, he already did. and he chose the wrong side. Across town, in a quiet suburban home, Josephine Carter sat in an armchair watching the evening news. The headline scrolled briefly at the bottom of the screen. Child found alive in abandoned home, investigation ongoing. Josephine's lips tightened. She reached for her phone. "We have a problem," she said calmly into the receiver. "One of them was found." A pause. "No," she continued, "it doesn't matter how. What matters is containment." She ended the call, eyes cold. Children talk. That's why they must be taught silence. Back at the hospital, the girl slept more peacefully than before. But as Frank watched her through the glass, he knew this was no longer about saving one child. It was about stopping something that had survived for years by counting on one simple truth, that no one listens when children cry. Until someone finally does. The first threat came quietly. Frank Holloway noticed it the moment he stepped out of his house the next morning. His front gate, which he always locked out of habit, stood slightly open. Not wide, just enough to make a point. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but something had been touched. Frank scanned the street. Retired couples watering lawns, a delivery truck 2 houses down. Normal. Too normal. He closed the gate carefully, his jaw tightening. After 3 decades in law enforcement, he knew the language of intimidation. This wasn't vandalism. It wasn't a warning shouted loud. It was a whisper. "We know where you live." Inside, Jamie was already at the kitchen table, nursing black coffee and looking grim. "Before you say anything," Jamie said, "no, it wasn't me." Frank nodded. "They're testing me." Jamie leaned forward. "Frank, internal affairs isn't the only problem anymore. If what you found is real, and I believe it is, this goes higher than badges." Frank picked up his keys. "Then we don't wait." They drove without sirens, without radios, an unmarked sedan, 2 men who technically shouldn't have been investigating anything at all. The second property was 30 minutes north, a pale blue house tucked between newer developments, like it had been forgotten while the world grew around it. Curtains drawn, lawn trimmed just enough to avoid complaints, occupied enough to look legal, silent enough to stay invisible. Frank parked down the block. "You feel that?" Jamie asked. Frank nodded. "Yeah, someone's watching." They approached on foot. The closer they got, the more wrong it felt. No toys, no bikes, no trash bins. Frank knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Then, soft, unmistakable, a thump. From inside. Jamie's breath caught. That was... "I know," Frank said. He tried the door. Locked. "Police!" Frank called out, loud enough for the street to hear. "If there's anyone inside, make yourself known." Silence. Then, a child's voice, thin, afraid. "Please, don't." Frank's heart slammed. "That's it," Jamie said. "We go in." Frank stepped back and kicked. The door cracked on the second blow. Inside, the smell hit them first. Stale food, cleaning chemicals, something sour underneath. They followed the sound. A boy sat on the floor of a back red room, knees pulled to his chest, maybe 7, dirt on his face, eyes wide with terror. "No, please don't make noise," she said. Frank dropped to his knees instantly. Hey, you're okay. You're not in trouble." The boy shook violently. "She'll come back." "Who?" Jamie asked gently. The boy whispered the name. "Mama Joe." Frank closed his eyes. Before they could say another word, a sharp clap echoed from the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Applause. "Well," a woman's voice called out, smooth and mocking. "This is unexpected." Josephine Carter stepped into the doorway, neatly dressed, gray hair pinned back, smile calm, practiced, terrifying in its ease.
"You shouldn't be here," she said lightly. "You're trespassing." Frank stood. "Step away from the child." Josephine sighed. "Official Holloway. Retired, aren't you?" "Not retired from conscience," Frank snapped. She glanced at Jamie. "And you must be the loyal friend. Always a weakness." Jamie moved instinctively in front of the boy. Josephine's eyes hardened just a fraction. "You're making this messy." Frank's voice rose. "You kept children locked in houses. You erased them." Josephine tilted her head. "I protected them." "By starving them? Silencing them?" "You have no idea what chaos looks like. You think the foster system is mercy? You think the streets are kinder?" She stepped closer, unafraid. "I gave them rules, safety, quiet. You gave them fear." She smiled sadly. "Fear keeps children alive." Sirens wailed in the distance. Josephine's eyes flicked to the window. "So you did call backup," she murmured. "This complicates things." She straightened, voice sharpening. "This ends now. You will leave, the boy stays, and the system continues exactly as designed." Frank stepped towards her. "Over my dead body." Josephine met his stare. "That can be arranged." Suddenly, footsteps thundered from the back door. Uniforms flooded in. Too fast, too coordinated. Entering last, Officer Harris, breathing hard, eyes darting between Frank and Josephine. "What's going on here?" Harris demanded. Josephine turned instantly, relief softening her features. "Thank God. Officer, these men broke into my property." Harris looked at Frank. "You were ordered off this case." "There's a child," Frank shouted, "right there." Harris didn't look. Instead, he said quietly, "Josephine Carter is a city contractor." Jamie exploded. "She's a trafficker." Harris snapped, "Watch your mouth." The boy whimpered. Frank stepped between Harris and the child. "If you take him, you're complicit." The room went deadly still. Harris lowered his voice. "Frank, walk away." Frank laughed, bitter. "You knew." Harris's jaw clenched. Josephine put a gentle hand on Harris's arm. "It's all right. He's emotional." Frank saw it then. The protection, the cover, the rot. "This isn't over," Frank said. Josephine leaned in close enough for only him to hear. "It is for you." Harris motioned to two officers. "Escort Mr. Holloway out." Jamie shouted, "You can't!" Frank turned back once more. He locked eyes with the boy. "I will come back," he said firmly. "I promise." The boy nodded, tears streaming. Outside, Harris followed Frank on the lawn. "You're making powerful enemies," Harris said. Frank faced him. "So are you." Harris swallowed. "This never happened." Frank leaned in. "It did, and it will again, because you forgot one thing." Harris frowned. "What's that?" Frank smiled grimly. "Kids grow up." That night, Frank's phone rang at 2:14 a.m. Unknown number. He answered. A child's voice whispered through the speaker. "They moved us." Frank sat upright. "Where?" he asked urgently. "I don't know," the voice said, "but Mama Joe is scared." The line went dead. Frank stared into the darkness. They were running, and now the hunt was real.
The house felt different after that night. Frank Holloway noticed it the moment he woke up. Not the physical space, the same worn recliner, the same faded photos on the wall, but the air. It carried weight now, purpose, and danger. The phone lay on the kitchen table where he dropped it after the call ended. They moved us. 3 words that burned deeper than any threat Josephine Carter had spoken to his face. Frank poured coffee he wouldn't drink and stared out the window as dawn crept over the quiet street. The neighborhood was still asleep, lawns untouched, curtains drawn, people trusting the world to stay orderly because men like him once stood between them and the truth. He picked up the phone and dialed Jamie. Jamie answered on the first ring. "Tell me you got that call too." Frank closed his eyes. So it wasn't just me. "No," Jamie said grimly. "They moved the kids, which means we scared them." "Good," Frank replied. "Fear makes people sloppy." Jamie exhaled slowly. "Frank, Harris was there. Uniforms. This isn't a rogue operation anymore." "I know." "Then you also know this goes way beyond a single woman." Frank looked at the old photo on the wall. Him in uniform, arm around his late wife, pride in his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "It's a network." They met an hour later in a diner that smelled like grease and old memories, the kind of place where waitresses called you hun and no one asked questions if you paid in cash. Jamie slid into the booth, eyes scanning the room out of habit. "We don't have jurisdiction," Jamie said quietly. "No badges, no backup." Frank stirred his coffee. "We have experience and time." Jamie snorted. "We don't have time. Kids are being relocated like cargo." Frank looked up sharply. "Then we make time by forcing mistakes." Jamie leaned back. "You thinking surveillance?" "I'm thinking pressure." Frank pulled a folded notebook from his jacket. Old, worn, the kind men kept when they didn't trust computers. "What's that?" Jamie asked. "Names," Frank said. "Cases that never made sense, false alarms, vacant properties, calls reassigned at the last minute." Jamie's eyebrows rose as Frank flipped pages. Addresses, dates, badge numbers. "I kept them," Frank said, "because children don't cry for no reason." Jamie swallowed. "Jesus, Frank." "Josephine wasn't careful," Frank continued. "She used abandoned houses tied to city contracts, properties no one questioned because the paperwork said unoccupied." Jamie leaned forward. "So where would they move next?" Frank tapped the notebook. "Anywhere someone powerful owns silence." Across town, Josephine Carter sat in a sunlit office sipping tea like the world wasn't burning beneath her feet. Her phone buzzed. She didn't answer immediately. Outside her window, Los Angeles pulsed with life. Cars, sirens, laughter. All of it oblivious to the quiet machinery she'd helped run for over a decade. She finally picked up. "They found one of the houses," the voice said tightly. Josephine smiled faintly. "I know." "The retired officer." "I handled him." There was a pause. "He didn't back down." Josephine's eyes darkened. "No, he won't." "That makes him a problem." Josephine closed her eyes briefly. "No, that makes him predictable." She set the cup down. "We adapt, move operations, increase layers. And the children? They'll be fine," she said smoothly. "They always are." The voice hesitated. "And the boy who called him?" Josephine's jaw tightened. "That won't happen again." By afternoon, Frank and Jamie were parked outside a records office Jamie still had access to through a favor owed. "You sure this is clean?" Jamie asked. "No, but it's necessary." They slipped inside, blending with retirees and clerks who didn't look twice at 2 older men with purpose in their stride. Jamie logged in. "What are we looking for?" he asked. Frank leaned closer. "Properties flagged inactive but receiving maintenance funds." Jamie's fingers flew. Rose appeared. His face drained. "Oh my God." Frank stared at the screen. "Dozens. No, hundreds. This isn't foster care," Jamie whispered. "This is storage." Frank clenched his fists. "Children warehoused in silence." Jamie scrolled further. "And look who signs off on inspections." Frank read the names. police supervisors, city council liaisons, judges. Jamie sat back slowly. Frank, this thing protects itself. Frank nodded. That's why we don't go public yet. Jamie looked at him. Yet? Frank's eyes hardened. We need proof that breathes, voices, faces. Jamie hesitated. You're thinking about the kids. I'm thinking about rescuing them. That night, Frank's house went dark, literally. The power cut without warning. Frank was already awake. He didn't move. Outside, tires crunched softly. Footsteps. Measured. Confident. Frank reached under the table and wrapped his fingers around the cold steel he hadn't touched in years. A knock came. Slow. Polite. Frank stood and opened the door. Officer Harris stood there, alone. Evening, Harris said. Frank studied him. Lose your escort? Harris sighed. You're not wrong, you know. Frank waited. Harris glanced down the street. They're watching you. Frank smiled thinly. I noticed. You don't understand how deep this goes. You can't win. Frank leaned against the doorframe. I don't need to win. I just need to make noise. Harris's voice dropped. They'll hurt you. Frank shrugged. They already hurt kids. Silence stretched. Then Harris said quietly, There's a warehouse. Frank's eyes sharpened. Where? Harris swallowed. East of the river, under a shell nonprofit. Why tell me? Frank asked. Harris's shoulders sagged. Because my niece disappeared 6 years ago, and her case looks like yours. Frank's grip tightened. Get me the address, Frank said, and disappear. Harris nodded once. After tonight, I was never here. He turned and walked away into the darkness. Frank closed the door and exhaled. Then he picked up the phone. Jamie, he said, we found them. Across the city, a group of children sat in a dimly lit room, mattresses lined against concrete walls. No windows, no clocks. A boy whispered, They're scared. Another asked, Who? The bad people, he replied. They keep arguing. A small girl hugged her knees. Does that mean we get to go home? The boy remembered Frank's eyes, steady, promise-filled. I think, he said softly, someone's coming. Above them, somewhere in the city of lies and paperwork, the system trembled just slightly, and for the first time in years, it didn't know whether it would survive the noise that was coming next. The city pushed back. Frank felt it before he saw it. The resistance didn't come loud or dramatic. No sirens, no flashing lights. It came quietly, the way powerful systems always defend themselves. Through locked doors, through silence, through fear that crept into places it didn't belong. By morning, the diner where Frank and Jamie always met was closed. A handwritten sign taped crookedly to the door read, Health Inspection, Indefinite Closure. Jamie stared at it, jaw tight. Funny how that happens overnight. Frank nodded. Their ceiling cracks. They stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary, two old cops who suddenly felt very visible. Where now? Jamie asked. Frank glanced down the street, then at the passing cars. Somewhere they don't expect us. The backlash began online. By noon, a post circulated on neighborhood forums and local Facebook groups. Someone had dug up Frank's retirement file. Former Officer Frank Holloway, forced early retirement amid questionable conduct. Jamie read the comments with growing anger. They're painting you as unstable, calling you obsessed, saying you had boundary issues with minors during welfare checks. Frank closed his eyes. That's deliberate, he said quietly. They're poisoning the well before we speak. You want to respond? Jamie asked. Frank shook his head. That's what they want. He folded the phone and slid it into his pocket. Truth doesn't argue. It waits. Josephine Carter watched the damage unfold from behind tinted glass. Her assistant scrolled through reports. Public sentiment is shifting, he said. People are starting to doubt him. Josephine nodded slowly. Good. But there's concern, he continued. He hasn't stopped. Josephine's lips pressed into a thin line. Men like him don't. What's our next move? She considered. We isolate. Isolation came fast. Frank's bank account froze without explanation. A notice claimed irregular activity. His doctor's office canceled his appointment pending review. Even the local library denied him access to archived records. System maintenance. Jamie slammed his fist against the dashboard when they were turned away from city records. They were racing you, he said. Frank stared straight ahead. They're trying. The warehouse sat quiet on the edge of the industrial district, disguised as a recycling center. Rusted fencing, no signage that mattered. Trucks came and went at odd hours. They watched from a borrowed van. Jamie adjusted the binoculars. Security's heavier than it should be. Frank nodded, which means we're right. They waited. Hours passed. Then a delivery truck arrived. No markings, plates partially obscured. Jamie's voice dropped. You see that? Frank's heart clenched as a small shape stepped down from the truck. A child. Another followed. And another. They moved in a line, heads down. Jamie swallowed hard. Jesus. Frank's hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage he hadn't felt in decades. We need proof, Jamie whispered. Frank lifted the camera. We get it. They didn't see the drone, not until it hovered. A faint whir. Jamie looked up. Frank? Too late. The drone zipped away. Frank exhaled slowly. They know we're here. Jamie started the engine. Then we move. Now. That night, Frank's phone rang from an unknown number. He answered without greeting. Still chasing ghosts? Josephine's voice purred. Frank closed his eyes. You should stop calling. You should stop digging. You're hurting people. Children aren't people now? Frank snapped. A pause. Then colder. They're assets. Frank's blood ran cold. You always did struggle with reality. This system keeps order. Order built on cages, Frank said. I won't be quiet. Josephine sighed. You will be. The line went dead. Jamie noticed the unmarked car 2 days later. It sat across the street from Frank's house, engine running, windows tinted. They're watching you, Jamie said. Frank nodded. Let them. That night, someone broke into Frank's home. They didn't steal anything. They rearranged things. Photos knocked off shelves, files scattered. The message clear. We can reach you. Frank sat amid the mess, breathing slowly. They want me afraid, he said. Jamie's voice cracked. Aren't you? Frank looked up. I'm furious. The backlash spilled into the department. Jamie was called in for a conversation. They questioned his loyalty, his judgment, his association with Frank. You're risking your pension, a supervisor warned. Jamie leaned back. I already earned it. He was suspended by the end of the day. That night, Jamie showed up at Frank's house with a duffel bag. They benched me, he said. Frank opened the door wider. Then welcome to the wrong side. Jamie smiled grimly. Been there before. Meanwhile, the children were moved again. The warehouse emptied overnight. Frank stared at the footage in disbelief. They're reacting too fast, Jamie said. Someone's feeding them information. Frank's mind raced. Then it hit him. Harris, he whispered. Jamie looked up. You think he flipped? Frank shook his head slowly. No, I think they found him. The next morning, Harris's name appeared in the news. Officer found dead in apparent suicide. Frank crushed the paper in his fist. They killed him, Jamie said. Frank's voice was hoarse. And they're daring us to stop. Silence followed. No calls, no threats, no movement.
The quiet was worse. Frank sat at the table staring at the notebook of names. "We can't protect everyone," Jamie said gently, "but we can protect some." Frank nodded. "Then we expose everything." Jamie hesitated. "That'll burn the city." Frank looked up, eyes hard and clear. "Good. It deserves to feel the heat." Outside, thunder rolled over Los Angeles. The storm was coming, and this time it wouldn't pass quietly.
The city didn't heal overnight, but it cracked open. By morning, every major network was running the same footage on loop. Children being carried out of a building that didn't exist, officers standing stunned, reporters whispering words they'd avoided for years, systemic failure, institutional silence, buried accountability. Frank watched it from a hard plastic chair in the hospital hallway, hands folded, eyes rimmed red. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the crying again, not just from that house, but from all the years he'd ignored the quiet sounds that didn't fit neatly into reports. Jamie stood nearby, phone buzzing nonstop. "They're calling it a historic breach," Jamie muttered, as if it was an accident. Frank didn't answer. He was watching the children. They sat wrapped in blankets, clutching juice boxes and stuffed animals someone had rushed in from a donation drive that sprang up overnight. Some stared blankly, some cried, some asked questions no one was ready to answer. Where am I going? Can I see my brother? Am I in trouble? A nurse knelt in front of one boy, maybe 7 years old. "You're safe now," she said gently. The boy didn't respond. Frank approached slowly, crouched to the child's level. "What's your name?" Frank asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "They said names didn't matter." Frank's chest tightened. "Well," he said softly, "they lied." By noon, the fallout spread. City Hall held an emergency press conference. The mayor's face was pale, jaw tight, eyes darting. "We were unaware." The crowd erupted. A reporter shouted, "Your signature is on the permits." Another yelled, "How many houses like this exist?" The mayor stepped back. By evening, 3 department heads resigned. By midnight, 2 were arrested. Josephine Carter's name finally surfaced, not as an accusation, but as a question no one could ignore anymore. Who protected her? Who benefited? Who signed off? She didn't appear in public, but she watched. Frank was called to testify 2 days later. The room was packed. Officials, lawyers, cameras, citizens standing along the walls because there weren't enough seats. Frank took the stand slowly. He didn't dress up. He didn't rehearse. He told the truth. "I ignored signs because paperwork was easier than confrontation, because procedure feels safer than conscience." A murmur rippled through the room. "I thought if something was wrong, someone else would stop it." He paused, voice thickening. "I was wrong." The silence afterward was heavy, not uncomfortable, necessary. Jamie testified next. He didn't hold back. He named names. He described threats. He detailed how reports disappeared and officers were reassigned after asking questions. Silence wasn't accidental. It was enforced. When the hearing ended, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The truth had weight enough. The children were placed in care, real care this time, independent agencies, outside oversight, no closed doors. Volunteers flooded in. So did apologies. Too many, too late. Frank visited the shelter every afternoon. At first, the children watched him cautiously. Then, one day, a girl handed him a crayon drawing. It showed a house with open doors. On the roof, she'd written one word: loud. Frank swallowed. Josephine Carter was arrested quietly. No handcuffs for the cameras, no press conference. Just a black car, a closed gate, a legacy collapsing behind tinted glass. Her lawyers claimed ignorance. The documents disagreed. So did the children's statements. The trial would take years, but for the first time, it would happen. Jamie resigned from the force, not in anger, in clarity. "I can't wear a badge in a system that tried to bury kids," Jamie told Frank. Frank understood. He turned in his retirement papers the same day. They walked out together. No ceremony, no speeches, just air that felt different. Months passed. The city changed slowly. Oversight boards formed, anonymous reporting lines opened, abandoned properties inspected. People paid attention. That was the difference. Frank began speaking at town halls, community centers, churches, anywhere people would listen. He didn't preach. He warned. Silence doesn't scream. It whispers, and if you're not listening, it gets comfortable. One afternoon, Frank received a letter. No return address. Inside was a photo. A little boy smiling on a playground, swing blurred midair. On the back, written carefully, "My name matters now. Thank you." Frank sat for a long time after that. On the anniversary of the rescue, a memorial plaque was placed outside the house that started it all. It didn't list officials. It didn't mention departments. It read, "We heard you." Frank stood beside Jamie as people laid flowers. A woman approached them quietly. "I live down the street. I heard crying once, and I told myself it wasn't my business." She paused, eyes wet. "I won't do that again." Frank nodded. "Neither will I." As dusk fell, the city lights flickered on. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Real laughter. Frank felt the ache in his bones, the kind that never fully leaves, but also something else. Relief. Not because the damage was undone, but because it was finally seen, and because the silence, the most dangerous thing of all, had been broken. For good.